My name is Kathy Garcia, and I am 68 years old. What I am about to share began on a warm evening in Austin, Texas, at a dinner that I should never have agreed to attend. The dining room was filled with the clatter of silverware and the polite laughter of relatives who looked right through me. They placed me at the end of the long table near the sliding door, a position that made me feel like an afterthought. I smiled politely, nodding when expected, but my plate carried more silence than food. I watched my son Daryl, sitting proudly near the center, his wife Sabrina at his side in a linen dress that shimmered under the light. She spoke with an air of command, the kind that demanded attention even when her words carried cruelty. She swirled her glass of wine and leaned forward as if preparing a performance. Her voice cut through the chatter, asking how it felt for me to live without contributing anything anymore. The laughter that followed was nervous and shallow, but it was laughter all the same. Even my grandson Mateo, still in high school, smirked as if to join the chorus. I felt the sting run deeper than any blade. My chest tightened, and for a moment I wanted to shrink into the chair. Yet I set my glass of water down with deliberate care, the sound sharp enough to quiet the table. My back straightened, and I let my eyes rest on Sabrina. The room felt suspended as I spoke, not in anger, but in a steady voice. I told them that this unhelpful old woman would no longer cover their bills. The silence was immediate. It pressed against the walls and clung to every breath. Sabrina's smile collapsed into confusion. Daryl's fork stopped midway to his lips, and Mateo lowered his gaze. I felt the power of words ripple through them, not because I shouted, but because I finally stopped pretending. My chair scraped against the wooden floor as I rose, the sound final and uncompromising. I collected my purse, nodded once to no one in particular, and walked out through the patio doors. The evening air met me like an old friend, cool and honest against my face. Beyond the garden, the Texas sky stretched wide and deep, painted with the last light of day. For the first time in years, I felt my lungs fill completely, as though I had been holding my breath all this time. I stood still, listening to the hum of cicadas, the clink of glasses fading behind me. In that moment, I understood I had crossed an invisible line, leaving behind the role of silent provider. The night opened before me with promise, and I realized I had not breathed freely in years. When I returned home that evening, the silence of my small house felt heavier than the voices I had left behind. I walked to my office and opened the bottom drawer of an old wooden cabinet. Inside were folders worn from years of handling their edges, curled their weight far greater than paper should ever feel. Each folder carried a part of my story, though not the part anyone in my family would care to read. I pulled one out and spread the contents across the desk. There were copies of transfers made late at night when Sabrina had overspent again. I saw receipts for boutique rent when the shop could not meet its payments. I saw notes for Daryl's credit card bills when he was too embarrassed to admit the balance had grown beyond his control. There were tuition payments for Mateo's private school, the kind of fees that should have been a shared responsibility, but somehow landed on me. Every page reminded me of a call, a hushed voice, a request dressed up as necessity. Being an accountant had trained me to keep records, and that habit became my only way of staying sane. I opened spreadsheets hidden deep on my computer, each line filled with dates, amounts, and reasons. At first, I thought keeping track would help me feel in control, but over time the growing totals felt more like shackles. What once seemed like love began to feel like duty, and finally it settled into a rhythm I did not even question. The transfers became automatic, as though I were less a person and more a system designed to catch them before they fell. I remembered the first time Sabrina brushed my cheek with a kiss and said she did not know what they would do without me. For a moment, I believed it was gratitude, but later I understood it was closer to a warning. I had become their safety net, dependable and invisible, a cushion that allowed them to take risks without fear. Each page in the folder was a wound that healed badly, scarring into silence. As I turned the papers, I realized my identity had been rewritten line by line. I was no longer Kathy, the mother, Kathy, the woman, or even Kathy, the retiree. I had become a shadow carrying their burdens. Sitting in the quiet of that office, I finally saw the truth that had been waiting in ink and numbers. I was not living for myself anymore. I was surviving as their silent safety net, and the weight of that realization pressed harder than any debt I had ever covered. I remember the year 2016 with a clarity that makes my chest ache. Sabrina's boutique was unraveling before it ever found its footing. Rent was overdue, suppliers were demanding payment, and the dreams she paraded to the family looked ready to collapse. Daryl's savings were already drained, and the bank had turned them down. They came to me with the kind of desperation that hides behind polished words. I agreed to help, but not without conditions. I told them I would provide $55,000, but only if Sabrina signed a notarized agreement. The paper was simple but firm. In exchange for my money, I would hold 51% ownership of the boutique. It was not generosity this time. It was protection. Sabrina barely skimmed the words. Her hands shook, her voice clipped with impatience. She signed quickly, sliding the document back across the table, as if it were just another receipt to be filed away. The notary stamped it, and I tucked it into a folder the next morning. From that day forward, I carried the contract like a quiet shield. It sat in my drawer year after year while the transfers and favors piled on top. I said nothing, and she assumed silence meant weakness. I let her believe I was too naive, too soft, or too forgetful to ever call it forward. What she never understood was that I had been underestimated my entire life, and underestimation has a way of sharpening a person. Sometimes I would open the drawer and see the pages resting among the records of all my sacrifices. I would run my hand across the bold ink of my name and hers. It reminded me that even while I was being used, I had planted a safeguard. She thought I had forgotten. I never did. I only waited. There is a bitterness in remembering how easily she dismissed me, how quick she was to sign without even looking. Yet beneath that bitterness grew a seed of empowerment. The contract was proof that I was not as powerless as they wanted me to believe. For years, I had been erased by my own giving, but that single document whispered otherwise. In the quiet of my home, I realized I was not entirely defeated. I was patient, and patience has its own kind of power. Sabrina came to me one afternoon, her voice sweet and her words rehearsed. She spoke of growth, of opportunity, of how the boutique was ready to expand if only she had the right backing. Then came the number $70,000, spoken lightly as if it were a simple favor. She asked me to co-sign the loan, assuring me it was just a formality. I looked her in the eye and told her firmly that I would not sign. I said I would no longer rescue them, not this time, not ever again. The silence that followed my refusal carried more weight than any argument. She laughed it off, pretending not to care, but I could see the crack in her confidence. A few days later, Daryl and Sabrina showed up at my house. Daryl's eyes carried unease, while Sabrina's mouth was set in a tight line. They sat in my living room, the air thick with unspoken demands. I walked to the cabinet, pulled out the thick folder that had lived there for years, and set it on the coffee table between us. Daryl reached for it first, his hands hesitant, his brow furrowed as he began to read. At first, confusion flickered across his face, then shock settled in. He turned to Sabrina, holding up the signed and notarized agreement that gave me majority ownership. His voice cracked as he asked if she had really signed this. Sabrina's denial came quickly, sharp and dismissive. She called it manipulation, claimed I had twisted the situation when she was vulnerable. I sat back in my chair, my voice calm but edged with steel. I told them it was not manipulation, it was accountability. I reminded them of the nights when calls came in hushed tones, when bills piled high, when I stepped in to save what would have collapsed. I had not taken control then, I had simply ensured that my sacrifices were not erased. The room grew still. Daryl held the papers in his lap, his face pale, his silence speaking louder than any defense. Sabrina's protest sounded thinner with each word. I felt the balance of power shift in that moment. For years I had been the quiet giver, the invisible net. Now the truth lay in black ink on white paper, and it was their turn to sit in silence. The letter came in a thick envelope delivered to my door. Inside were the words I had expected but still dreaded. Sabrina was suing me, claiming the contract had been signed under pressure and that I had taken advantage of her distress. For a moment, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the papers, feeling the old weight of exhaustion pressing in. Then I picked up the phone and called Donna Ruiz, a retired litigator whose mind was still sharp as glass. Donna met me with calm certainty. She asked for every scrap of evidence I had kept over the years. I brought her the notarized contract the bank transfers the receipts for tuition, rent, and boutique expenses. She laid them out in order, her fingers tapping lightly across the dates and signatures. She looked up at me with a nod that carried confidence. This would hold. The courtroom was hushed on the day of the hearing. Sabrina sat stiff beside her attorney, her eyes flashing with practiced indignation. Daryl sat behind her, his face drawn and weary, his silence already louder than her protests. Donna rose when called and presented the documents. Her voice was steady, her arguments grounded in fact. She showed the judge the contract stamped and notarized the transfers marked by bank records, the clear trail of my financial involvement. Sabrina's lawyer spoke of coercion, of undue influence of a mother-in-law who had preyed on vulnerability. But the judge, a silver-haired woman with lines etched deep by years of listening, was not swayed by rhetoric. She examined the pages carefully, then lifted her gaze. Her ruling was simple. The evidence was clear. Ownership stands. The sound of the gavel striking wood carried through the room like a final chord. Sabrina flinched, her complexion pale, her confidence drained. Daryl lowered his head, unable to meet my eyes. I felt no surge of triumph, no urge to celebrate. What I felt was the deep release of truth finally spoken aloud, a truth that could not be erased. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight poured across the steps, warm against my face. I inhaled slowly, filling my lungs with air that felt new, as if I had been waiting years for this breath. The city noise hummed around me, distant and unimportant. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the light remind me that I was still here, and that at last I was standing in my own freedom. 6 months passed, and my life had settled into a rhythm that felt entirely mine. I had moved into a small house near the lake in Austin, a place where the mornings were painted with soft light and the calls of birds. Each day began with my hands in the soil, tending to rows of herbs and flowers that seemed to grow stronger as I did. Afternoons were spent painting clumsy landscapes by the window, or sitting with women and young students who wanted to learn the basics of money management. Teaching them gave me purpose, and for the first time in decades, I felt both useful and free on my own terms. One bright afternoon, Mateo arrived carrying a folded sheet of paper. He grinned shyly as he handed me a drawing of Grandma's garden with crooked flowers and a sun smiling above them. My heart swelled in a way no contract or payment ever could. I placed the drawing on the refrigerator door, knowing it was a gift of love, untainted by obligation. Later that week, the phone rang, and Daryl's voice cracked through the line. He said he had made mistakes, that he had let pride and weakness guide him, and he asked if we could try again. I sat in silence for a moment, weighing the years behind us. Then I told him I would not rescue him anymore, but I would give him the chance to stand on his own. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was the door left open for him to walk through if he chose. That evening, Mateo knelt beside me in the garden as the sun slid low across the lake. I pressed a small plant into his hands and showed him how to place it in the soil. I told him that even broken ground can bloom again if it is cared for. As we covered the roots with earth, I felt a gentle peace settle over me. Family, I realized, is not about money. It is about respect and the courage to begin again. As I stood with Mateo in the fading light, I understood that healing does not always come from winning or losing. It comes from knowing when to stop giving away pieces of yourself and when to allow others to carry their own weight. Boundaries are not walls. They are the lines that protect love from turning into burden. My journey taught me that respect cannot be begged or bought. It must be chosen by both sides. If you have ever felt invisible or taken for granted, remember that it is never too late to reclaim your voice and plant something new in your life. I would love to know what this story made you think about. Share your reflections in the comments below. If it touched your heart, press like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss another story of strength and renewal.